I am delighted that Rabbi Dr. Gary Zola is joining us this evening. Dr. Zola is the executive director of the American Jewish Archives, and I appreciate that he's taken the time from his schedule to talk with us. And I asked him here to explore with us the relationship of the Jewish community to the African American community. Because oftentimes we have this image, some of us grew up with the image, a strong image of Abraham Heschel, a very famous Jewish leader, marching with Dr. Martin Luther King, and we talk about those strong ties that the Jewish community has had with the African American community. And I'm curious, is that our relationship, or has it been more nuanced than that over the years?
Well, first, let me say I'm really happy to be here. I'm always happy to be invited to speak at Beth Adam and to participate. And your rabbi and I have been friends for, I guess, close to 4 decades now. So
I was 12 when we started.
Yeah, and I was 8.
Right.
But at any rate, it's wonderful to be with you, Rabbi. But yes, I think we love, as Jews, we love to go back to the civil rights period, because the truth is that that was one of our great moments, because it has been established that during the civil rights period, Jews represented a larger proportion of the white civil rights activists than any other ethnic group in America. We were overrepresented. More of our clergy, more of our young people in those days were. But we, of course, tend to imprecisely assume that that means there was uniformity and everybody agreed and everybody thought the same way, and that's just not the case. It was a great moment, and historians tend to think that probably one of the main reasons, not the only, but one of the important reasons why during the civil rights period there was such energy behind the civil rights movement and why Jews wanted to be involved was it began to unfold really at the same time that there was this growing awareness in America of what really happened in the Holocaust and its horror. And you had the discussions begin really in the late 50s to talking about the Holocaust. America was growing in its consciousness. Think about the book we've all been moved by, Night. Elie Wiesel comes out in 1961. You know, all of this is happening as the African Americans, the blacks, are arguing for civil rights. So Jews were motivated in a way that was unique.
So just so we interrupt you. So if that's a highlight, it means that before that relationship wasn't quite the same.
That's right. I would say that, well, there's a number of books, wonderful books on Jews and blacks in America. It's a subject that's been really studied. And there's one book that's called Strangers and Neighbors. And, or there's another book called something like Strange Alliance. The whole relationship of Jews and blacks in America, which really begins in the 19th century, around the 1840s, that relationship has been characterized all the way through, even to the present day, with a special closeness and yet moments of real tension. There's one synagogue that I know of that is still in usage. That was, without question, built by slaves.
Really?
Yeah. And that's Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim in Charleston, South Carolina, which was built in the year 1840. Now, it was probably not the only, but that is the only one I know of today that is still in usage that still exists and is still standing because, of course, many of those synagogues that were built in the 1840s and 1850s while slavery was still standing, those were torn down at some point.
So that's a sort of an interesting issue, sort of crystallizes. How has that congregation, I mean, this is sort of the great American sin is slavery. Here is a Jewish institution literally housed in a house built by slaves. And the White House, there are other places that have been built by slaves, but how does that Jewish congregation, and or what should that Jewish congregation do to wrestle with that history, just like America has to wrestle with our history of slavery and how it has informed and changed society?
The reason that congregation comes to mind is because that congregation, which, by the way, if any of you ever have an opportunity to be in Charleston, don't miss seeing that congregation. It's such a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful synagogue, and historic because it's the only one that is the oldest in continuous usage in America. Right. And the reason it came up, Rabbi, is because they recently refurbished the building. It was leaking in the roof, and it needed, just like the Plum Street Temple, it needed an entire refurbishment. And just before the pandemic hit, they were starting to plan for their dedication. And they are going to do something when they're able to acknowledge this black spot on their history. And that will, so they are going to deal with that. They realize that their house of worship was built by slaves in good part. And the other thing about slavery, which I'm going to assume that the very capable and intelligent members of Beth Adam know this already, that there were Jews in the South who owned slaves. Mm-hmm. And so this is often, sometimes people are, especially in the North, Jews in the North today are often like, what? That can't be true.
And there were on both sides of the Civil War. There were rabbis who were preaching against slavery and were
in favor of slavery, right? Prayers written for the Confederacy that explicitly by religious leaders, Jewish religious leaders, who explicitly say that the North is trying to take our property, and they're referring not just to land, they're referring to their slaves. Now, it is true that few Jews owned massive plantations. That wasn't their business, but it's already been, Jewish scholars have unearthed all of this years and years ago, and it's all been documented that Jews owned slaves to the same degree as other white people. And so going back to your original question, every period of our American history, you see moments of that I think you and I and most of us would say were moments in which we should take pride because of Jews who themselves were a minority, who themselves were suffering from bigotry, step up and really go out of their way to do something for another minority, especially the African American, who is at that time in the 19th century the most outstanding example of a sufferer of indignity. Mm-hmm. But in every period, even at moments when there were great heroic effort on the part of Jews, you also have shameful behavior. Let's not forget, you know this, you're from Detroit. Mm-hmm. At the very time that Goodman and Schwerner lost their lives in the South, we had scumlords, Jews in the North, right, charging outrageous amounts in terms of their buildings and so forth.
So if we've gone a little bit, we went back in time, the civil rights movement after. So since the civil rights movement, where has the Jewish community been, and where are we now, given what we're witnessing? And we're living at a really challenging time in American history, where the African American community, the murder of George Floyd, I mean, and there's multiple. That's the one most current, but we know there is systemic racism. Where is the Jewish community in this conversation right now? Are we on the good side of it? Are we on the bad side of it? Are we even in the midst of the conversation?
Well, I'll just say that, again, historically, usually 1968 is where historians often say this is where that special relationship began to fracture.
Right.
And there are many reasons for it. It was the year that Dr. King died. There were a whole variety of the Vietnam War, many reasons. This was the year of Crown Heights, where those of you who don't remember, you had, unfortunately, the Hasidic rabbi was driving in an entourage accidentally. A black child was killed. Then there was the teachers union in New York, where the upsurge of African Americans who wanted to be taught by people who looked like them, that resulted in tension between Jewish teachers in the public schools in New York. Many things. It should also be mentioned that a person who's worked now for decades, literally decades, to destroy the relationship between Jews and blacks, and has been very successful despite the small numbers of his own followers, and that is Louis Farrakhan.
Right.
Because Louis Farrakhan's book, The Secret Relationship Between the Blacks and the Jews, which is a disaster, these have all contributed. But even in this period that we're talking about, there's been moments of closeness. If you look into the media, if you look into music, the music world, very often the partnerships between black artists and Jewish producers, there's a whole world of connection between them. But right now, to get to today, I'm happy to say, I hope you would agree, it seems for sure that the African American, that the Jewish community in all of its manifestations has come out very vigorously in opposition to what's going on and with the police brutality, and has spoken out. Every organization in the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, every national organization.
So AIPAC came out.
Everybody has made a point of this. But now the question is, as the black community is saying, okay, thank you. Now what are we going to do?
Right.
And I suspect that, and I don't know that I have any greater wisdom than you do, Rabbi, on this, but I guess I would say I've been moved by what President Obama said the other day, where he pointed out, okay, now you have to systematize, you have to legalize, we have this, the feeling in our hearts has to be now translated into substantial action. And that's going to, it's true that about a third, maybe a quarter of the American Jewish community is impoverished. Most people don't know that.
Right.
But the 2/3 of us, or the 3/4 of us who are not impoverished, we have to do our part. And we can't, we have to be a part of the solution. It's not enough just to say we're against racism and issue statements. And it's not even enough just to go marching. It's now time, and that's going to be through corporate America, where we have influence, and it's going to have to be through the media, where we have influence, and it's going to have to be through politics, where we have influence if not because of numbers, but because of finances, something I know you know, Rabbi, better than I do. But that's my answer.
Right, right. No, I think that's so important that we don't leave it at this moment. That's, I think, my concern, frankly, is that people will sign statements or issue statements or march, and then the protests subside and everyone goes, oh, everything's okay. And I think from the conversations I'm having is the sense of systemic problems that we need to be involved in. The problem took a long time to create. It will take a long time to solve.
Well, tell me this, because this is my metaphor. In your long and distinguished career here in Cincinnati, at your congregation, wouldn't you say that there are a number of things that are really important to you in terms of your teaching that you must teach again and again and again and again? That I bet you could identify certain themes, certain issues that no matter how important they are to you, and no matter how many times you've lectured on it or you taught the lesson, you have to repeat it. Am I right about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the nature of being a rabbi. Sometimes and there are days I go, haven't I said this before? But you do. You go back to it. And it's not just with kids. You do that with adults. And frankly, too, a friend of mine, a retired colleague of ours, once said to me, there are days he gave sermons that were for nobody else but for himself, and he let people listen. And sometimes I get to remind myself what's important, to hone in back on what is essential and what is core. And
I know that for me too, at the college, there are certain issues that I think are behind us, and then they come back. And it's like, because there's always a new generation. So what I'm trying to say is, in my opinion, you are correct. It's not something that we can say, well, we did a good job. We spoke out, we marched, we went onto the streets, and now everything. This is a story we're not going to be able to let up on. And we just have to learn to live with that we have to keep our foot on that pedal. And the reason is because number one, it's the right thing to do. And it's what our tradition calls upon us to do. And the second, more utilitarian and less noble, is that if we want to create a society where we as a religious minority feel safe and accepted and respected, then we need to make sure that the entire apparatus in which we operate functions that way. And if it's a racist society, it will never be a society that is good for the Jews. Mm-hmm. And shouldn't be the only reason we act. It should be, well, I'll tell you this one story very quickly. I remember once I was teaching a group of confirmands at the American Jewish Archives, and I was saying, the reason why Jews have always been involved in minority rights, majority rules, but minority rights. Why? Is because it's in our own self-interest. And then a little confirmand put her hand up and said to me, well, Rabbi, wouldn't you say that the Torah has something to say about that too? Mm-hmm. And I never taught it again. In other words, she was right and I was wrong. It's our ethical heritage. It's the best of what our ancestors gave to us that should motivate us never to give up on this issue.
Well, I have to say, I think that is a wonderful way to draw our conversation to a close. I appreciate your insights. I have always loved learning from you and studying with you and calling you a friend.
Amen.
And I appreciate you taking the time. Be well. Be safe.
You too, Rabbi. Thank you very much. And to everybody, my best.
Thank you.